The sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline when she pressed her palm flat against the mounded earth and said goodbye to the only man who had ever truly understood her. The grave was fresh, the clay still dark with turned moisture, and the wooden cross her own hands had fitted together stood at a slight lean, the way everything on the Vance ranch stood, not quite fallen, not quite right, but enduring. She had wrapped him in the good quilt. She had sung the 2 hymns he favored. She had done these things alone, because there was no one else left to do them, and when she rose from her knees, the morning light came sideways across the hill and lit the frost on the bunch grass so that the whole slope looked, for just a moment, like something worth saving. She carried his ledger inside her coat, pressed against her ribs. She had found it in the drawer beside his bed, tucked beneath a folded letter he had never sent. The ledger was small and cloth-bound, its pages warped from years of handling, and in his careful schoolteacher's hand, strange, that carefulness, for a man who had broken 2 fingers and never had them set right, he had recorded every dollar borrowed and every dollar hoped for. 3 years of drought, 3 years of cattle prices that barely covered the grass they ate, and at the bottom of the last page, underlined twice, Cull, $740, due 40 days from first frost. First frost had come 11 days ago. She stood at the fence when she got back, not because she meant to stop there, but because her legs simply did. The ranch spread out behind her, the leaning barn, the smokehouse her father had built from salvaged pine, the kitchen garden gone to seed and frost-killed, the cabin with its single window facing east. She knew every board of it. Every cold morning it had asked something of her and she had given it. She was 23 years old and she had never lived anywhere else, and she did not intend to start. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A deliberate, unhurried sound, a man who wished to be heard approaching, which was its own kind of courtesy and its own kind of warning. He sat his gray gelding with the ease of a man who owned a great many things and had grown accustomed to the weight of that ownership. His coat was good wool. His expression was not unkind. He had removed his hat before he reached the fence, which she noted, because small gestures were how men like this made cruelty feel like civility. He told her he was sorry for her loss. She believed he was, in the way a man can be sorry and still mean to have what he has come for. Then he told her about the horse. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting on the fence post, the ledger pressing its familiar corner into her ribs, while the sun at last came over the ridge and lit the frost all around them like a field of broken glass. She told him yes before the silence could fill itself with doubt. It was not a reckless yes. It was the kind that comes from having already weighed every other option and found them wanting. The kind that feels less like courage than like arithmetic. $740 against 40 days. The ranch against a horse no man had been able to keep his bones whole around. She looked at Cull's face as she said it and watched something move behind his eyes, brief and unreadable, like a fish turning in deep water. He settled his hat back onto his head. He told her he would have the round pen ready by morning. By nightfall, the whole of the town knew. She could not have said how news moved that fast in a place with no telegraph and only one road, except that small towns had their own kind of wire, and it was made of idleness and appetite. When she rode through for flour and lamp oil that afternoon, she could feel it, the way conversations paused and did not quite resume until she had passed. A woman outside the dry goods store said something to her companion behind a raised hand. 2 men on the steps of the feed depot watched her with expressions she had learned to read since girlhood. Not malice exactly, but the particular anticipation of witnessing a mistake. The wager was already written on a chalkboard inside the general store before supper time. She heard about it from the miller's boy, who told her with the guileless enthusiasm of a child delivering interesting information, the man leading it, a horse trader who had appointed himself the district's authority on all things hooved, had drawn a crowd and a column of names. The odds being offered were not generous. She did not go in to read the board. There was nothing written on it that she needed to know. That evening she lit the coal oil lamp and sat in her father's chair, the one nearest the stove, which still held the shape of him in its worn leather. The blue heeler settled against her feet with a small circular adjustment, nose to tail, and breathed slowly. Outside, the wind had come up cold and purposeful across the high grass, and the lamp's flame leaned gently each time a draft found the window's edge. She opened the ledger to the page she had found 3 nights after the burial, when she had finally been able to make herself look. Her father had not been a flowery man. His handwriting was plain and forward-leaning, like a man walking into weather. But on that page, amid the careful columns of water rights and cattle weights and weather observations, he had written something that did not fit the ledger's accounting logic, a full paragraph, unhurried, as though he had sat there on a quiet evening much like this one, and simply wanted to set something down before it escaped him. Waiting on the horse, he had written, is not a trick. It is a conversation begun in the horse's language, not your own. The lamp burned low. Patch did not stir. She was up before the sun had fully committed to rising, the cold floor finding her bare feet before she remembered to reach for her boots. The ledger went into her coat pocket. She had taken to carrying it those last days, the way some women carried a Bible, and she stepped outside, into a morning that smelled of frost and far-off cedar. The ride took her the better part of an hour. She knew the road by now in the way you know a hymn you have sung too many times to count, and she let the mare find her own pace while Patch ran the ditch line, nose down, pleased with his commission. The sky went from gray to pale gold, to the color of old brass, and she watched it the way her father had taught her to watch weather, not for beauty, but for information. Today, it told her only that the world intended to continue. The round pen sat inside the near pasture of Cull's property, a circle of heavy rail fencing, perhaps 60 feet across, well-made and solid. 2 of Cull's hired men were already at the fence when she arrived, arms folded against the cold, their faces arranged in the particular expression of men who have already decided what they are about to witness. She did not look at them long. He was at the far rail, and everything the town had said about him was true and insufficient. He was very large and very black, and the white star on his forehead caught the morning light like a lamp someone had left burning in a dark room. His ears were flat against his skull. When he heard the gate latch, his whole body organized itself into a kind of furious attention, and he struck the rail once, a sound like a rifle shot, then wheeled and struck it again. She entered and closed the gate behind her. She did not reach for him. She did not speak. She stood near the gate in the posture of someone who has simply stopped walking and is content to remain stopped. Weight even, hands open at her sides, eyes cast slightly down and to the side, away from his. He charged the rail to her left, pulling up short, sending the dirt up in a small dark wave. She did not move. Her legs began to ache sometime around what she guessed was mid-morning. She had no way to be certain. The sun had moved. Patch had settled at the base of the fence outside. She could see the tip of one ear through the bottom rail, and his stillness was its own small gift. She left before the horse did. That was the method. You did not wait for him to dismiss you. You left while it was still your choice. On the road home, the fear came, the way cold water comes in through a bad boot, gradually, and then all at once. She had not let herself feel it while she stood in that pen. Now she let Patch press against her leg, and she breathed the cedar air, and felt, without shame, how frightened she was. She went back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that. The days had a sameness to them that she came to depend on. Rise before light, feed the mare and the 2 remaining steers, check the kitchen garden the late squash was holding, barely, read 3 lines of her father's ledger, not for information but for the shape of his handwriting, the particular slant of his 7s. Then the 2-mile ride, Patch trotting ahead with his nose low, reading the road the way he always had, as though every morning held a slightly different message worth deciphering. The black horse stopped charging the rail on the 7th day. She did not celebrate. She was not even certain, in the moment, that she had seen it right. Perhaps he had simply tired early, perhaps the morning cold had taken some of the fury out of him. She stood in her usual place and felt the change, the way you feel a shift in the wind before you can name which direction it has moved. He was still at the far end of the pen. He still would not look at her, but the charging had stopped, and the silence between them was different in quality from the silence that had come before. Less wall, more distance. She left when it was still her choice. On the 8th day she brought the same offered feed, a small handful of cracked corn in her open palm, and held it out at her side, not toward him, the way you might leave a cup of water on a table for someone who has not yet said they are thirsty. He did not come. She did not expect him to. She set the corn on the fence rail when she left, and did not look back to see whether he took it. On the 12th morning, she became aware of someone at the fence. He was older, built close to the ground, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent decades watching animals rather than speaking to them. He wore a worn leather vest and held his hat in both hands in front of him. Not a greeting posture, not a leaving posture, just watching. The black horse, she noticed, did not spook at his presence. She did not acknowledge the man. She continued her work, which was not work in the way most people understood work. No rope, no movement, no visible effort, only standing, only waiting. After a long while, long enough that she had almost forgotten he was there, the old vaquero spoke. "You are doing it right." 4 words, quietly said, not loud enough to carry to anyone but her. She did not answer immediately. She kept her eyes on the ground to her left, on the particular patch of red dirt she had memorized over 12 mornings. The stallion stood at the far curve of the pen with his ears half turned toward her. She said, "Thank you," and meant it, the way you mean something when you have been walking alone for a long time and someone confirms the road. The old vaquero did not come again that day, and she did not look for him. She carried his 4 words home, the way you carry an ember in cupped hands, carefully, without looking directly at it, grateful for the warmth. Then the cold came. It arrived on the 15th morning as a color change in the sky. Not a gathering of clouds, but a flattening of the light, the blue leaching out of it, until the horizon looked like pewter left untended. She rode out anyway, the dog trotting ahead of her with his ears laid low against the wind. By the time she reached the pen, the temperature had dropped enough that her breath made small clouds before her face, and the prairie grass lay pressed flat in the direction of the gusts, all of it pointing the same direction, like an argument being made by the land itself. The stallion wanted none of her. He stood at the far arc of the round pen, his black coat rippling in the wind, his tail blown sideways. His eyes were somewhere distant, somewhere she could not follow. She took her place at the pen's center and stood as she always stood, hands loose, weight even, gaze soft and off to the side, but the animal gave her nothing in return. Not hostility, not the flattened ears and rolling whites of genuine fear, simply absence. He had gone somewhere inside himself the way a fire goes to coals and offers neither warmth nor light. She stood for 2 hours on the 15th day. 2 hours on the 16th. The cold did not relent. On the 17th morning he came. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A confident, self-pleased canter that slowed to a deliberate stop outside the pen's fence. She did not turn. She heard him settle in the saddle, heard him make a sound in his throat, the satisfied small noise of a man who has found the thing he came looking for. She kept her gaze on the red dirt. The stallion, for his part, flicked one ear toward the fence, and then returned to his private distance. The visitor stayed perhaps 20 minutes. Then he left at the same self-pleased canter. She stayed another hour after that, in the cold, in the wind, doing the thing he had ridden out to confirm was nothing. The ranch house was very quiet when she returned. The fire had gone low while she was away, and the kitchen held the particular chill of a room that has given up its warmth gradually, without drama. She built the fire back and set water to boil and cut salt pork into a pan, and when the food was ready, she sat at the table and ate because she understood that eating was part of the work, same as standing, same as returning each morning. She could not have told you what the food tasted like. She opened her father's ledger and ran her finger down the column of numbers, not reading, not calculating, just touching. Outside, the wind pressed against the house like something that wanted in. The days between the 7th and the 20th had a sameness to them that was not discouragement, but not hope either. It was the country between those two territories. The flat, gray miles a traveler crosses because there is no other way to reach where she is going. She rose before light. She rode the 2 miles. She stood in the pen. She came home. She ate. She slept. She rose again. Patch trotted at the horse's heels each morning without being asked, and on the coldest mornings he would settle himself against the base of the fence post closest to her, and put his chin on his paws and simply be there, the way a good dog understands that presence itself is a form of labor. The stallion had not moved closer, but he had stopped moving away quite so quickly, and she noticed this the way you notice a change in a familiar sound. Not certain at first, then certain. On the 20th day she did something different. She had brought dried corn from the smokehouse, a small fistful of it, and she held it on her open palm before she even crossed the threshold of the pen gate. Not as a trick, not as a lure, only as an offering made visible, the way you might set a candle in a window for someone you do not know if you will see again. She stood near the center of the pen. The stallion was at his corner of the world, and the world between them was cold and still and considerable. She did not look at him directly. She looked at a place slightly past him, at the fence and the sky above it, and she kept her palm flat and her arm low and her breathing even. Minutes passed the way they do when you are not measuring them. Then she heard him shift. It was a single sound, one hoof resettling in the dirt, and then silence again. Then another shift. She did not turn her head. She only kept the palm open and the arm quiet, and her whole self as unhurried as she could make it. And she was aware of him the way you are aware of weather moving across open ground before you can name what it is. His nose came to within 2 inches of her hand. She felt the warmth of his breath before she felt anything else, a soft heat against her palm, against the corn she held there. He did not take the corn. He did not close the last distance. He only breathed against her hand for a moment, something between question and statement, and then he pulled back and turned away, and stood with his head toward the far fence, as if nothing had happened. She kept her arm down until her shoulder began to ache. Then she lowered it slowly. Her hands were shaking. She rode home the way you ride when something has shifted inside you and you are afraid to examine it too closely for fear it will dissolve. That night, by lamplight, she opened her father's ledger and wrote in the margin, in small, careful letters. He breathed on my hand. Day 20. The days after day 20 moved differently, slower and somehow gentler, the way a river slows when it widens into a broader channel. The weather held mild for late in the season, and the light coming off the plains each morning had a particular quality she had noticed only in years, when autumn came without hurry, a gold that did not burn, but simply rested on everything it touched. She came to the pen the same as always. She stood, she waited. The stallion was learning the shape of her stillness, and she was learning the shape of his uncertainty, where it lived in him, which corner of the pen he retreated to when the world felt large, how his ears worked before his feet did. On a morning near the end of the 3rd week, the old vaquero brought 2 tin cups and a cloth bundle to the fence line and sat down on the top rail the way men do when they have decided to stop being in a hurry. He set 1 cup beside her, without a word, and unwrapped cornbread and cured meat, and divided it on the cloth between them. Across the pen, the stallion lifted his head and watched them both. They ate without speaking for a while. That kind of quiet is a language between people who work with animals, a confirmation that neither of them intended to make demands of the moment. Then the old vaquero said, without particular preamble, that he had known her father. Not well, he said, but enough. He had been through the valley 6-7 years ago, working cattle up from the south, and he had stopped 2 nights at the Vance place during the drought year when the creek dropped to nothing. He remembered her father as a man who did not perform his kindness, who simply did it and then turned to something else, as if the doing were the ordinary thing. He told her about a saddle, a good one, barely a season old, hand-tooled. Her father had traded it to a neighbor, a family whose milk cow had died and whose children were thin, and he had accepted in return something of no practical value at all, some small repayment that was more gesture than substance, and he had seemed satisfied by this. Had seemed, the old vaquero said, to consider it simply an even trade. She had not heard that story. She held the tin cup in both hands and looked at the far mountains and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the thing she felt. The stallion, across the pen, had not moved from where he stood, but he was watching them, not in the flat, defensive way of the early days, but with something that looked almost like consideration. His ears were forward, his weight was settled. By day 28, he had begun, without prompting, to drift toward the corner where she stood each morning. Not to her, not yet. Only toward that corner, as if something in that piece of ground had become, slowly and without ceremony, a place that held less fear than the rest. He came on the 30th day. She heard the creak of the gate latch before she saw him, a sound that was different from Aurelio's easy footfall, more deliberate, as if the hinges themselves recognized authority. She did not turn. The stallion's ears swiveled first, one, then the other, and his weight shifted forward a half step before he caught himself and stilled. That small hesitation, the gathering, then the holding, was something she had not seen him do a week ago. A week ago he would have wheeled and put the full width of the pen between himself and any new presence. Now he only paused and watched and waited to see what would be required of him. She went on standing as she had been standing, hands at her sides, weight even. The morning light was pale and thin, the kind that arrived before it had fully committed to the day, and her shadow lay long and quiet across the dust. He stood at the fence for an hour. She knew this not because she watched him, but because the light changed, and Patch shifted twice at the rail, and the stallion's ear moved once in the visitor's direction, and then came back to her. He was a patient man, she would grant him that. He watched the way a man watches something he has paid for and is not yet certain he has received full value from, carefully, without expression, reserving judgment until the ledger had been fully reviewed. He said nothing until he was ready to go. Then he said, simply, that 10 days remained. Not 10 days until she would fail, not 10 days until he would take the land. Only 10 days remained, stated as a fact, the way a man states the distance to water or the depth of a frost. He said it without malice, and that was the particular quality of him that she had come to understand. Cruelty was not his motive, and never had been. Precision was. He wanted the land because the land was useful, and the debt was a mechanism, and 10 days was 10 days. She said she was aware of the count. He nodded once and left the way he came, and the gate latched behind him with the same deliberate sound. The stallion let out a long breath. She stayed until the light grew warm and the horse had drifted, unhurried, to the corner where she stood. Not to her hand, not yet, but close enough that she could hear him breathing, steady and low, the way a creature breathes when it is not afraid. That evening, 2 miles away in the settlement, a notice appeared in the window of the general store. She did not see it herself, Aurelio told her the next morning, quietly, turning his hat in his hands. The horse trader had posted it himself, in large, careful letters, announcing his absolute confidence in her failure. He would, the notice read, provide supper for the whole town on the night the foreclosure was signed. He had already chosen the menu. She did not speak of the notice. What would have been the point? The morning came the same as every other morning. Cold air through the window, the ledger on the table where she always left it, Patch already waiting at the door, with his ears tilted forward and his tail moving in slow, patient arcs. She saddled up in the dark and they went, the two of them, through the frost-stiffened grass and across the low ridge that separated her land from the 2 miles of open range between herself and the pen. On the 31st morning, she came through the gate and stopped. He was standing at the center of the pen. Not at the fence, not in the far corner where he had held his distance all these weeks. The center, that wide, exposed, surrendered middle, and he was facing the gate, his great black head lifted, both ears forward, watching her arrive as though he had been there some time already, as though the waiting had been his. She did not rush. She let the gate latch behind her and stood where she always stood, near enough to be present and far enough to mean no harm, and she breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe in this pen, slowly, from low in the chest, the way her father had shown her when she was small and frightened of a difficult mare. "Don't let the animal hear your worry," he had said. "They already know it's there. Just let it settle." She let it settle. He did not come all the way. That was not the point, and she had learned by now not to measure distance in feet. She measured it in choice. He took 3 steps toward her, deliberate, unhurried, each hoof placed with care, and then he stopped, and they stood together in the cold morning air, with perhaps 12 feet of frost-pale earth between them, and neither one moved. At the fence, Patch rose from where he had been lying. He did not bark. He simply stood, and his tail moved once, slowly, like a flag in still weather. She did not reach out her hand. The time for that was not yet, and she knew it the way she knew the smell of coming snow, or the sound a fence post makes when the ground has heaved beneath it, a knowledge that lived in the body rather than the mind. She simply breathed. She stood. She let him look at her. The sun came up behind the eastern hills, and the light moved across the pen in a long, level sheet, catching the white star on his forehead, so that it seemed, for a moment, to give off its own small glow. He did not look away. Neither did she. Days 36 and 37 moved through her like weather, slow and heavy and inescapable. Each morning, she rode the 2 miles in the blue dark, Patch trotting at the mare's heels with his ears pricked and his breath making small clouds in the cold. Each morning, the stallion was already watching when she entered the pen, already turned toward her before she had taken 3 steps from the gate, as though he had been counting the hours in his own way. He came close now. That was the thing that made her chest ache with something she could not name, equal parts hope and helplessness. He came within 10 feet, within 8, within the reach of her outstretched arm if she had dared to extend it, and then he drifted, not in fear, not in defiance, but with a kind of deliberate ease, as though to say, "I know the distance. I am the one who holds it." She did not reach. She had never once reached when he had not offered, and she would not begin now. But the restraint cost her something. She could feel it paying out of her each afternoon, like rope unreeling from a spool that was not bottomless. On the morning of day 38, she stood in the pen for 3 hours without him closing the distance at all. He circled, he grazed, he regarded her from across the pen with those dark, ancient eyes, and she stood, and she breathed, and she waited. The sun moved. Her feet ached. When she finally left through the gate, her hands were trembling slightly, though not from cold. That evening, she sat on the top rail of the fence outside her father's barn, Patch warm against her boot, the stars coming out one by one over the dark plain. There was no one to hear her. She spoke anyway, quietly, in the way her father had sometimes spoken over a sick animal, not expecting an answer, just needing the words to have somewhere to go. She told Patch she was afraid, not of the horse. She had never been afraid of the horse. She was afraid of day 40, coming with the distance still unmeasured, the stallion still holding himself just beyond the moment. She was afraid of standing in that pen while men watched and felt vindicated. She was afraid of a piece of paper that said, the land was no longer theirs, and of what it would mean for everything her father had bent his back toward for 30 years. Patch pressed his nose against her knee. She told him what her father used to say, that the hardest part of waiting was trusting that what you were waiting for had already decided to come, that the animal already knew, that the last thing between them was not distance at all, but time. She rose before the sun on the 39th morning and stood at the window a long while, watching the dark plain lighten from black to gray to the pale color of old bone. Patch was already at the door, tail moving in slow, certain arcs, as if he had known the night before that this day was different. She did not hurry. She built the fire, boiled the coffee, ate a piece of bread standing at the counter. She folded her father's ledger into her coat pocket the way she always did, not for luck, but because she had never been able to leave it behind. Then she went out to saddle the roan, and they made the 2-mile ride to Cull's property in the early quiet, Patch trotting steadily alongside. They were already there. A line of men at the rail, Ferris with his arms crossed and his mouth set in a thin, satisfied patience, 2 others beside him, and behind them, a scatter of townspeople who had come the way people come, to witness something they expect to go wrong. Cull stood apart from the rest, near the corner post, his coat buttoned against the morning chill. He said nothing when she arrived. She said nothing back. She tied the roan, unlatched the pen gate, and went in. The stallion was at the far side, his head up, watching. The white star on his forehead caught the early light. She walked to her usual spot, the center left, where the shadow of the fence post fell, and she stopped. She let her hands hang open at her sides. She did not look at him directly. Behind her, the men at the rail were quiet too, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that waits to be rewarded with failure. She stood. The stallion stood. The sun crept higher, and the cold began to ease out of the air, degree by degree. 40 minutes, perhaps 50. She did not count. She had learned early that counting made the waiting into something else, a transaction, a demand, and so she had taught herself to simply be inside the time without measuring it. And then she heard it, the soft, particular sound of large hooves moving through dust without urgency, without alarm. Not the stiff-legged circling she had known in the early weeks. Something different, something decided. She kept her eyes low and her hands open. The warmth reached her before she saw him, the great heat of him, the hay and dark earth smell, and then the weight of his head came down, heavy and real and gentle, settling into her open palms. She did not move. She did not make a sound. Behind her, the whole line of witnesses went absolutely still. She held that stillness as long as it asked of her. The head was heavier than she had imagined it would be, not the symbolic weight she had carried in her mind these 39 mornings, but the true, animal weight of bone and muscle, and something that had finally decided to trust. Her palms curved around his jaw. She felt the slow, warm exhale move across her wrists. Behind her, no one spoke. Not the men at the rail, not the cattle baron who had built the pen and written the terms and stood now at the edge of his own making, not the horse trader whose public certainty had hung in the air for 5 weeks, like smoke that would not clear. The silence lasted long enough to become a kind of answer. That evening, in the small office off the main house, a paper changed hands. There was no speech made over it, no magnanimity performed for an audience. The pen moved across the bottom of the document in a hand accustomed to signing things, and then the paper was set on the corner of the desk and not looked at again. She folded it once and placed it inside the leather cover of her father's ledger, which she carried back across the 2 miles of darkening plain without speaking to anyone. The morning of the 40th day came up pale and clean. She had risen before the light fully committed to itself, moving through the cold kitchen by memory and lamp glow, eating what little there was without tasting it. The ledger sat on the table where she had placed it the night before. She put it in her coat pocket before she went out. He was waiting in the pen, the way a horse waits when it has settled into the idea of a person, not with eagerness exactly, but with recognition. She brought the bridle, and he dipped his head into it, as though he had been doing so all his life, as though the weeks of circling and watching and measuring had been only a long breath held before agreement. She cinched the saddle, and he stood square and still. She mounted. The plain opened ahead of her the way a plain does at that hour, not dramatic, not announcing itself, simply present in its full breadth, the light coming low across the grass and the frost burning off each blade as the warmth reached it. Behind her, from the fence line, the small dog fell into an easy lope alongside, steady and sure and asking nothing. She did not hurry. The ranch would be there when she arrived. The leaning barn, the smokehouse, the kitchen garden waiting on its seeds. Her father's name on the ledger, freed now of its numbers. She let the stallion choose the pace. He chose